there's always a tension, in terms of private property rights as to whether you keep growing timber or you build a golf course and a resort or something else. At some time, Bob Straub, who was then state treasurer, became aware of the fact that the Highway Commission was intent upon building a reconstructed Highway 101, up the Nestucca Spit. Bob thought that was a terrible despoliation of a wonderful piece of Oregon. We began, one way or another, to mount a campaign hoping to change the Highway Commission's mind. And at one point, we had a Mother's Day march where we brought all our families down to the southern portion, that is, that headland, and of course television covered it, and so Tom McCall was put in a very difficult position because he didn't want to see a highway on the sand spit, but he didn't want to offend the chairman of the Highway Commission either. And it wasn't until about probably 1971 that he simply realized that the public opposition to the idea was overwhelming. And it's kind of an interesting thing, but at that point in Oregon history, people were beginning to sense the importance of conservation of resources and the need for recreational opportunities, whereas the idea of straightening 101 so that log trucks could move more easily had been a kind of a no-brainer earlier. It suddenly presented conflict between economic opportunity on the one hand and citizens' recreational opportunity on the other hand. And so it was a classic of that kind of conflict. I was Natural Resource Director for Bob Straub. Throughout his 4 years of governorship, there's in that office a good deal of interaction with the federal government, and that goes on sort of topically, what's happening in the Forest Service and in the Corps of Engineers and so on. Those agencies of the federal government that have a lot of activity here in Oregon relative to federal lands that are owned by them. The Oregon Board of Forestry has a long history. It goes back to a forester by the name of Elliott, who was forester, I think, around 1911 or 1912, something like that. The board was a relatively large board, and it was dominated by timber landowners. The way the statute read is that there would be 3 from each of the southwestern Oregon counties, the northwestern Oregon counties, and the eastern Oregon counties and that the landowners would nominate a slate from which the governor could choose the members of the Board of Forestry. So that was not a very public entity. Well, that was the old Board of Forestry. Neil and his natural resource advisor, Gail Achterman, worked to develop with the legislature a new Board of Forestry, which would have no more than 3 members who took a significant portion of their income from forestry, and 4 public members. And that was the new Board of Forestry that I was appointed to in '87. And I was one of the public members. During that period, we particularly advanced something called the Forestry Program for Oregon. The forest program for Oregon that we developed looked more broadly, not only at trees as a part of the resource to be managed, but other animals and resources like clean water and clean air. And so we aim to look a little more broadly at the question of how you managed and regulated that resource. For one reason or another, '64 was a great year for abolition. Well, we were responding to a referendum from the legislature to abolish the death penalty. Every one of the statewide elected officials in Oregon was opposed to the death penalty. The entire congressional delegation was opposed to the death penalty. And obviously, a lot of legislators were opposed to the death penalty. In that year, there was only one district attorney who was in favor of the death penalty, at least outspokenly, and would speak to that effect among 36 district attorneys. The campaign was mostly a matter of getting all these politicians to make a speech or put out a press release that indicated their position. We had some volunteered public opinion testing by Reed College students that, interestingly enough, identified the fact that people were personally opposed to the death penalty, but they also didn't want to be associated with the actual killing. In other words, they like to divorce themselves from the idea of capital punishment. And probably, as long as they didn't know very much about it, they wouldn't rise to the point of disparaging it. But if we could bring it home to them that it was their decision and their doing, that would be making a difference. this is the bus front. The billboard was almost identical to this, except that up in one corner it said, "You are the executioner, vote 9 no." And with an exclamation point. Some people thought it was tasteless, but it was, I think, quite effective. I don't know whether you'd convince them of this, but of course it's fun. I mean, it gives you a dimension of life that is broader. Even in today's world, the interest that anybody would evidence in supporting a legislative candidate or a representative or senator would be appreciated. In other words, your willingness to distribute lawn signs on Saturday afternoon or is noted and gives you access to a class of people that are doing interesting things and who can help you join them in doing interesting things. You can also say that these things are a part of the responsibility of being a citizen and building the fabric out of which democracy is made.